Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is blaming Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for the 25% U.S. tariffs headed our way on February 1st. Smith says diplomacy is the way to go, not retaliatory tariffs. Well, joining us now is our legislative reporter and the National Post Alberta correspondent, Tyler Dawson. Your thoughts, Tyler? Diplomacy or retaliation?
Well, it seems like it's going to have to be both at some point.
Okay.
There seems to be a large-ranging consensus that there's going to need to be some sort of retaliation at some point if there are tariffs brought into effect. To give one example, Mark Carney, the Liberal leadership candidate, Edmonton boy, as it happens, grew up here, although it was born actually in the Northwest Territories. He said that retaliatory tariffs should be used to raise money to then support Canadian workers. So that's just one example of how those tariffs could potentially be used here. Now, Danielle Smith, as we've talked about on the program before, has been on this real charm offensive in the United States, going back to mid-November, late November, I think, was when she first met with all the Western governors in the U.S. She was at Mar-a-Lago a couple of weeks ago. She's been in Washington for the past several days, meeting with folks in the Capitol, and was supposed to attend the inauguration, but of course then it moved inside. So she was one of the unlucky ones, I think, that didn't get into the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building. But what's interesting is that Smith has sort of conceded that there's going to need to be some sort of retaliation, but is still really, really pushing on diplomacy. She's saying, look, we didn't get the day one tariffs. February 1st seems to be the date that Trump is now mulling around. We have this reprieve. We should really be talking about the benefits of free trade, how it enriches both Canadians and Americans, and try and reach some other solution. She's really shied away from retaliatory tariffs, especially on Alberta energy exports. And the reason I find that interesting is because she's very, very offside with almost every other political leader in the country. Pierre Poilievre has talked about how there needs to be retaliatory tariffs. The Prime Minister and the people around him have talked about it. The Liberal leadership candidates have talked about it. All the other premiers are on board with some sort of United Canada response. The only allies she's actually got especially on the Alberta energy front, is the Bloc Québécois, actually, who have spoken out with her and said there should not be surtaxes or something on Alberta energy. So a really interesting situation. Time's going to tell, I think, whose strategy is borne out. But Smith is putting, I think, a lot of political capital on this. And so I think it's really notable that she is very much in a different spot than other political leaders right now.
Well, isn't it fascinating? You bring up Blanchette with the Bloc Québécois. And I mean, he says it's actually absurd, to hold back our energy, our oil and gas and so forth, which is, pretty kind of bizarre coming from Quebec, right? But he's got a good point, I think, in the sense that he's arguing that, hey, you know what? If the U.S. in the meantime finds some other countries to supply their oil and gas, then it could potentially put Canada in a pretty weak negotiating place once we want to get back on exporting oil and gas to them. They're going, hey, we've already got some. So I understand where he's coming from.
No, absolutely. There's a bunch of different things happening. I mean, a lot of our oil goes to sort of the U.S. Midwest and to the Gulf Coast, where there's all these refineries that have been built or retrofitted to process sort of Alberta heavy crude. The U.S. doesn't really produce any of that, which is why they want ours. But they can get it from elsewhere if they need to. And maybe more to the point, and the real long-term risk, if you were to bring in some sort of export ban, is that those facilities will say, well, we'll just retrofit. We'll retrofit to process American crude. And then we actually wouldn't have anywhere to sell our oil. And that, I think, is why you're also seeing Alberta politicians talk a lot about, sort of reviving Energy East or reviving Northern Gateway or finding some other sort of points of export for Alberta oil to send overseas. And there is a market.
Oh, absolutely there is, yeah. I mean, I think that would be wisdom to do, but we'd have to refine some of our federal rules, wouldn't we? So
we would, and it would not be a fast process. I mean, no one's building a pipeline to Kitimat in the next 6 weeks or something.
Yeah, it's expensive and takes time. I mean, I think, I think it's important also to know your friends and adversaries, okay? So, and Trump is a little bit of both right now, but Danielle Smith points out that Trump doesn't respond well to threats. And I think she's right. He does seem to respond well when he's shown respect and when he's flattered, for that matter. So, is there wisdom in what she's doing? She's obviously betting heavily on that, and I think she might be on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a good argument to be made that this situation calls for sort of a good cop, bad cop
Yeah.
situation. I mean, I think you're right. I don't think, I mean, even if it wasn't Donald Trump, we can't really bully the United States. Our
Hmm.
economy is
Yeah.
simply not that
Yeah.
powerful. We are
Yeah.
not that powerful. So I do think there has to be a good cop, bad cop, a carrot and a stick, however you want to frame it. So in that sense, I think there's probably some value. I mean, her critics are saying that, look, this is undermining the sort of pan-Canadian response. Um, and to use another example, we just talked about Yves-François Blanchet. Premier Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, who's a fairly reliable Alberta ally in sort of sticking it to Ottawa, has been more on board with sort of this pan-Canadian response. He was a signatory on a letter from the Council of the Federation last week that Danielle Smith did not sign. So I think you're right. I mean, I think that the risk that all Canadian politicians are making right now is, to what extent can Donald Trump be appeased? Is this really about the border? Is this really about drugs? Is this really about migrants? Can the economic arguments sway him? Or is this an idea that he's become fixated upon and genuinely believes, and there's maybe no way to shake him off that? Again, time will tell, which is the worst analytical line you can use, but I just don't think we know if he is amenable to persuasion at this point.
Yeah, he's very unpredictable, and that gives him some sway, I guess, and it's just how he seems to operate. Now, again, he's been saying about our borders need to be secured, and I think that is true, regardless of any tariffs. So we need to do that, especially now with the tariffs, though, and as well as restricting fentanyl going across the border. And Smith, I think, makes a valid point too by saying that there has to be a major acceleration from Canada to meet the NATO requirement of 2% of GDP. And just to demonstrate to the U.S. that, we are a reliable partner in energy security. And, yeah, it's going to cost us some money. But I just, the way I view it anyway, just big picture going, okay, who is Trump? What's he going to respond to? I think that's probably wisdom as well, if we would do so.
Yeah, and the United States is obviously a pretty substantial seller of military equipment. So if we were to,
Yeah.
I don't know, start buying tanks or airplanes or something, good chance some of them would come from the United States, which of course, if we talk about this trade deficit that Donald Trump is concerned about, this idea that the U.S. is selling more to Canada than it's getting back, that a big expenditure on military materiel might sort of smooth that out a little bit. Of course, most of that trade deficit is due to oil and gas. If you factor out the oil and gas, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada, and that is what it is. But I think the NATO commitment is going to be something we're going to hear a lot about. I think it's. I mean, it's interesting to hear a provincial premier talking about it, of course, because it's not Danielle Smith or Rob Ford or Doug Ford, I should say, his jurisdiction. Which is neither here nor there, but I do think we're going to end up hearing a lot about that in the Liberal leadership race, and certainly in the election this time of year, some point this year, because it's not 100% clear what Pierre Poilievre plans to do on NATO spending. He's trying to he's talked a bit about reducing the size of government, reducing government expenditure, but of course, getting another 0.5% of GDP or whatever that exact figure is on military spending is going to be a substantial increase in spending out of Ottawa.
Well, it would be, yeah. They'll have to switch something around, some priorities around. So, we'll see what he does with that. Certainly, I think there's a lot of bureaucracy that could be. You see that that's happening. I think in the States as well. They're getting rid of some long-time government employees, right? And maybe that needs to happen here in Canada as well. It's a huge cost to the system. So now, Premier Smith also suggesting that it might be helpful if the federal government repealed federal anti-energy policies, and again, maybe that would send a positive signal to Trump. I guess it's possible. It certainly wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, and I think the other way you're seeing a lot of economists talk about this right now is if we assume that we can't make Donald Trump happy, if we assume that tariffs are coming, well, what can Canada do to sort of weather that storm? I mean, part of this is the talk of retaliatory tariffs, but part of this certainly is trying to make Alberta and Canada and other provinces a more appealing investment jurisdiction. So, for example, that could be something like major project approvals, which of course happens through the Impact Assessment Act, which people better know as Bill C-69, which people better know as the No More Pipelines Bill. So you could potentially, if we're in the responding era, what might be some of those things that could change. You could certainly see some changes to corporate taxation or business tax rates. You could see some cuts to red tape. You could see some reform of some of this legislation that critics have argued make Canada an unattractive investment climate. Now, I think if Pierre Poilievre wins the next election, we're certainly going to see some changes on the environmental and project approvals front, regardless, just because his party has been opposed to these things for a very long time. But there is this sort of, there's the retaliation thing, there's the diplomacy thing, and then underneath all of this is a bunch of eggheads and journalists sort of paying attention to what are some of the other things we might be able to do, and that's things like reducing interprovincial trade barriers and finding other export markets for our goods, not just energy, but other goods as well. And that sort of thing. So there's sort of multiple conversations happening all at once here, and I think you're right that we're going to see some of that other stuff, especially on some of the energy-related legislation and infrastructure stuff that's gonna come up for discussion.
Yeah. Well. And if we do happen to get some sort of, I know there's been talk of, special status for Alberta, and if we were to get that, on the tariffs, there's been talk of Prime Minister Trudeau placing an export tax on Alberta oil and gas. That money's just going to go to Ottawa, right, and not to Alberta. So Alberta talking about potentially creating a public body that would buy all private oil and gas intended for export to the U.S., which apparently would protect Alberta somehow from the federal export tax, because I guess, one Canadian government can't tax another. Have you heard anything more on that at all? Is the Premier gonna do that?
Well, I don't know for sure where they bounced the idea around, and I think Ted Morton, the former finance minister and a political science professor, I think has made a similar argument. My sense of that case is that it's not super clear cut. It is true that the government can't tax things twice, basically. It's less clear, I think, whether or not that would apply in this case. As in, does the Alberta government simply declaring all this oil is theirs, does that exempt them from federal taxation powers?
So it's maybe not as easy as it sounds. There may have to be some hoops to jump through if that could potentially work. But
certainly it's the sort of thing that'll end up in court. There's some precedent in terms of the carbon tax stuff on where jurisdiction ends and begins, and if it's a tax versus a levy, and yada yada yada. I would not surprise me to see some of these sort of attempts made by the Alberta government. I don't think it's clear cut that that's going to succeed. But then, you know what, from a political perspective in Alberta, that doesn't necessarily matter. Maybe from a business and economics perspective, that stuff really matters. But at least part of what Danielle Smith needs to do is to be seen standing up for Alberta's largest industry. So she doesn't need to win this case. It's the same with all the other court cases that the Alberta government has had over the years against the federal government. We don't need to. We didn't win the carbon tax case, right? But
the political posturing needs to be there, I think.
Exactly.
Fair enough. The voting, public needs to or wants to see that, I think. So now, if we could switch maybe from oil and gas to coal here. Now, the UCP, they lifted the moratorium. It was maybe done a bit quietly here on coal exploration in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So you want to unpack that for us a bit here?
Yeah, so this is a big deal, I think. It's a big deal down your way too, because of the Grassy Mountain coal mine, I think, all that going on, and concern about the watershed. So there's been a moratorium on sort of coal exploration and stuff like that on the eastern slope since I think 1976. It did obviously still happen a little bit, and back in I think it was 2020, Premier Jason Kenney lifted that moratorium and sort of opened the door to more coal exploration and stuff like that on the eastern slopes. And there's this huge blowback. And my sense at the time was that the Kenney government went, these urban environmentalists, they don't understand the realities of rural Alberta and why people want more development and things like that. And then, of course, it turned out that a lot of this blowback was actually from small town and rural Alberta. It was not eco activists in Edmonton who were, they were mad, but it was also the people that the UCP really wants to keep happy who are mad about this. So they switched that back. They stopped selling exploration leases and stuff like that. And the Alberta government has, for the last year or so, maybe 2 years, been kind of working on this new coal sort of consultation process, the new coal permit development process. They've been working on some sort of process on how a prospective developer would go into developing a coal mine. Those rules, that process are not done yet. But one of the things that they did do was lift this moratorium, the one that had been reimposed by the Kenney government. And so this has obviously been rather controversial among some of the folks who oppose this. Corb Lund, the country singer, who's been, one of the more prominent voices opposing coal exploration, has been tweeting about it. There's certainly been some concern that this, will not protect the eastern slopes in the way that certainly some people want. So
well, I think part of it too is, because there's again, $15 billion in, potentially having to be paid out to these companies, these large companies that have, had to pull back now. They've invested money. You promised us this, Alberta, now you're changing your mind, so we're losing money. So you got to reimburse us for that. And so it could be in response to that as well, because that money is going to be coming out from your pocket and my pocket, right? That's just reality. So.
Exactly, that sort of back and forth led these big companies to sue and say, yeah, we put all this money into trying to get this process underway. And so if they've changed the rules, they've maybe sort of blown the bottom out of that legal case is perhaps one of the reasons that this has happened.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see how this all plays out. And I got to keep it short because of time here. But you know what? Hearing back from some of the Southern Albertans here, talking about the Grassy Mountain coal mine. I mean, that is actually designed to make steel. So, which is a different perspective as well. That coal is going to be put into steel, and there are local First Nations tribes there that say, hey, you know what? We want the jobs, and we want some of the the spin-off money from the royalties and so forth from that, because it's on their land. So there's a lot of things going on here that it will be very interesting in the next few years here, I think. Hey, thanks so much for your time, Tyler. Been a good conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Tyler Dawson, our legislative reporter and the National Post's Alberta correspondent.